All progress in conceptual knowledge and pure theory consists precisely in surpassing this first sensory immediacy. The object of knowledge recedes more and more into the distance, so that for knowledge critically reflecting upon itself, it comes ultimately to appear as an infinitely remote point, an endless task, and yet, in this apparent distance, it achieves its ideal specification. Ernest Cassirer, Philosophy of Symbolic Forms.
Interpretation, application, contemplation, walking, running, working, etc. Any process you can think of, physical or mental, is one or another form of objectification. The object of any activity is, as Cassirer says, only an index, something that serves to induce or catalyze action or motion. Only if the object of desire or intention, or attention, is far enough from where you stand will you move towards it. We respond to such stimuli with reaching, grasping, stretching, or mentally, thinking, reasoning, analyzing, etc. Those, let's call them prehensive functions, vary depending on the nature of their object. By the same token, the nature of the object becomes associated with this mode of prehension, i.e., the way in which it causes us to tend to it. The more complex the object is, the more complex is our tendency towards it. Objects are instrumental in the same way. Our understanding and our use of an object is the same thing. The mental exercise of naming and explaining an object corresponds to the physical exercise of using it. Or let's say, the mental analysis is the square root of its physical translation. The physical activity is just a recapitulated or amplified mental activity. Thus, a thought process is only truly consistent and scientific when the name of the object reflects its use, or if you can infer the idea of this object without having directly observed it, constructing it a priori from raw language concepts. Think of any object, an object that you see every day. For example, iron. We understand by iron an object of sense, something we can see, touch, and use. If you're a chemist, you might give me an equation. If a blacksmith, you might show me something iron can do. But an independent contemplation of this material leads us, incidentally, to pragmatism. That iron is simply the use which we make of it. Its idea is the idea of using it. The difference is that of what you see and what a material engineer and metallurgist sees. What I mean is, iron is the properties that make iron. It is what we understand as its essential qualities, the purposes or uses for which we know it to be employed, the conceptual or nominal object which captures the above two in a simple semantic formula. The fact that we, people untrained in metallurgy and material engineering, see is not the same as what a metallurgist or a chemist sees, being that they see finer details, is in no way grounds for dismissing as dubious the validity of our own experience. As Heidegger holds, the actual experience of seeing and using the material, iron, is what truly constitutes it. People have been using iron long before they could peer into and analyze its molecular structure using the instruments of modern science. Understanding iron at those intricate levels only improved our use of it by improving our understanding of it, but not the pure experience of actually using it. Its intrinsically instrumental relation to me will not and cannot change however sophisticated or primal my instrumentalizing, i.e., whether it's used by an Iron Age blacksmith or an Industrial Age aeronautical engineer. They are one and the same in being instrumentations of iron. Modern science confuses, or let's say, sees no distinction between the material composition of iron, its robustness, density, etc., and its instrumental nature. It sees no distinction, and this indistinction is justified in a way, but, ironically, not on scientific grounds. Because, although it's given that iron is an instrument, our analysis, our study of this material, i.e. the mental exercise, is not thought of as instrumental in itself, or even related to iron the substance, or that the very analyticity or intelligibility of iron presupposes or at least anticipates its instrumental nature. The properties which it lays bare to us, the motive which drives us to view it analytically are somehow not related to their product. We confuse the analysis with the material itself. It's not strange to us that we're able to, in the first place, treat this material or any other material in this way. It's not bizarre that our environment appears somewhat instrumental to us, because we forget that other part of the equation which the scientist is prone to ignore, that it's not simply a piece of iron, but a human being looking at a piece of iron. Thus, a truly logically descriptive semantic representation of this phenomenon, or relation, a truly timeless linguistic formula that would consistently apply in all fields of knowledge as concerns iron, will be one that directly captures this basic fact, or take it into account. This we find nowhere else but in the Quran, in which the term iron is animated through a metaphorical extension. Iron, hadid, is also used to mean limit or boundary, something that severs. And in the context of iron use, it tells us that there is something to it of enforcing or limiting. In the context of the Quran, the limits of God, for example, are only limits if they're enforced or demarcated as such. The act or process of enforcing a limit or demarcating is the essential, practical, human realization of iron, or in the Heideggerian sense, its mode of equipment or readiness at hand. In short, its definition. The quality of enforcing is meaningful on the presupposition of a state of flux. Thus, we grant that the world, or the given situation into which iron is to be factored, is homogeneous and undefined, or in a state of continuity, or as wanting of definition, and iron as a mode of equipment, as marking off one thing with respect to another. Like in the following verse where everything seems fine until comes a situation where the lines are suddenly drawn. The advantage of this semantic formula, hadid, is that it covers all alloys or metals, but always within the parameters of human experience. Thus we read in verse 97 of chapter 18 of Zubur al-Hadid, the varieties of metal or iron, which we see is quite appropriate for the underlying purpose of building a barrier. Plus, the Quranic conception of iron brings a whole new phenomenological understanding of this material, as various reductions of the concept of enforcing or delimiting can be made into corresponding activities like chiseling, drilling, welding, forging, grinding, shredding, etc., all of which are offshoots of the single conceptual framework supplied by the Quran. An industrial engineer juggles around copper, zinc, lead, nickel, mercury, tin, i.e. Zubur al-Hadid, but always as different metals or alloys, as their common medium. We see this commonness when we see them as equivalent to one another, or as part of the same family. And although at times implicit to someone who only deals with this or that type, knowledge of the genus is indispensable and relates to them as their general or underlying motive. And we find on reflection that this commonness, that which they have in common, is nothing but this function of enforcing or delimiting. But to see it, we must, like Descartes' wax, look for that property which does not change as we vary from one metallic substance to another. Thus hadid, though often equated with iron, would be whatever the general name we use to represent any metallic substance, or in use, any metallic property. Thus metal or iron would be the context vector, and the different types of metal or iron are various exponents represented on the same line. These examples are simply meant to show that where instrumentalism is concerned, we must always account for the fact that the instrumental experience is essentially a human experience. We say this because the reduction in the mode of experience from gold, tin, or lead to the genus, metal, corresponds or is simultaneous with a reduction of my own vocation as their observer, or user. For instance, whereas I might think of myself as being a goldsmith, a brass worker, or a nickel plater, when I come to think of either nickel or gold as types of metal, my vocation as a goldsmith, for example, is accordingly adjusted to that of the metallurgist, i.e., to a level isomorphic with the genus of the object. Thus, to state the matter clearly, to each experience vector, its appropriate vocation, and vice versa. Hence the proposition made earlier that the mental exercise, as regards any experience, must be understood to correspond exactly with the object of description, or that the object is simply the mode of objectification. Schopenhauer remains the same when he says,
"The world is my representation, a truth valid with reference to every living and knowing being, although man alone can bring it into reflective, abstract consciousness. If he really does so, philosophical discernment has dawned on him. It then becomes clear and certain to him that he does not know a sun and earth, but only an eye that sees a sun, a hand that feels an earth. The world is will and representation."
The truth, as conceived by Schopenhauer, runs, like Ariadne's thread, through the theory of knowledge, a truth which, if given its due, would have a stronger impact on science and our general view of the world than the Copernican revolution, and would leave us as stunned as Cardinal Bellarmine when he looked through Galileo's telescope. I say stronger impact because an epistemology grounded on perfect cognizance of human sensibility, that understands that our world is a world modulated by human sensibility, as was Hume's project, could only have a positive, enriching, and diversifying effect on our worldview, as it would teach and show us what to look at, or principally, not to take objects independently from the way we judge them. No longer would it then be necessary, or even reasonable, to quite indiscriminately place the incredibly rich array of life on a spectrum with man as their most developed form, that interprets the languages of animal as a rudimentary phase that the human has eclipsed by a stupendous distance. Instead, it would recognize that, as the saying goes, to each their own, and wildlife will be understood as homologous, not analogous, to our humanly colored Weltanschauung, as complex other worlds, as intellectually rich as ours, but closed off to us, as ours is to them. Instead of imagining deer, turtle, and birds, as in some sense unlucky not to have been born human, we may look at it in terms of Spinoza's conadas, that each thing ceased to persist in being. The stone, as Borges put it, eternally wants to be a stone, and a tiger a tiger. That perhaps the sense of superiority we feel over them is just an expression of this self-preserving principle, which they feel just as strongly as we do ours. We read in the Quran how Solomon communicated with birds, or as the verse reads,
"We have been taught the language of birds and been given everything."
The term communicated here is only putting it loosely. The word used in Arabic is mantiq, translated as speech or language, the same word used by Abraham in verse 92 of chapter 37 in reference to the effigies. Why won't you speak? ما لكم لا تنطقون. The same word used in describing how God will make skin talk to testify against its owner in Judgment Day. We see that the word is specifically applied in exceptional conditions, where something which does not or should not speak, speaks, like the statue, the skin, or even Solomon speaking the language of birds, telling us that mantiq refers to speech as an ontic or emergent phenomenon, as a direct expression of being, or as Herder put it, the soul's first judgment. In Arabic, the word mantiq is used synonymously with logic, or let's say mantiq means logic in Arabic. What Aristotle calls entelechy mirrors mantiq, being that mantiq, like entelechy, points to something primal. The act of speech, that is, language as opposed to this or that specific sentence, word, or proposition, is always and ever an original act, being it's a certain will exhibited by a certain species, but also expressive of the whole nature or logic of the species. At the highest level of abstraction, details blur out, multiplicity vanishes, circumstances and contexts vanish. We're left with something like a Euclidean or metrical space of points and forces, modes of experience as basal as that which we discerned in the word iron earlier. Here motion and speech are not different, since, as said, context is done away with. A whole species, like man, though a genus housing billions of people. A wide array of ideologies, physical appearances, cultures, languages, histories, but at the level of abstraction we're dealing with, that gave us the Quran, humanity, with all its bustle, breaks down to a general attitude and its various manifestations. All that we think we know about humanity now consists in this one attitude and its unique relation to the environment. Thus, in certain places, God addresses man as one man, insan, and in other instances speaks of genders, nations, and tribes, but always as diminutions or offshoots of some general attitude. This is owing to the different levels of abstraction between which the Quran strategically oscillates, in accordance with the vector vocation principle that we established earlier. And again, this helps maintain the consistency of our reasoning. Higher logical classifications apply to broader areas and, in turn, allow us to make Mantiq or analogical propositions such as Mantiq falls under. We can only call an orange tree a plant or an ant an insect because we're reasoning or classifying at a level higher than genre, or at a level that allows us to view genre. This is highly relevant as far as the view that all distinct species subsist in their own, let's say, logical sphere. Sphere is unique to them and closed off to other species. In Solomon we see something of a rare case. This isn't a case of a man who happened to hear the sound that birds emit and associated them, like the behaviorists of today, to instinctual impulses like fear, hunger, desire, and such. Rather, we're talking a world as psychologically rich and complex as ours, a world never before accessed by a man, being suddenly unveiled to him. By Mantiq, Solomon intends to say, not the language of birds per se, but the Voltenschaft of the bird species, their psyche. Not only would he have understood their speech, but he will have known their different subspecies, their diverse psychological attributes, what distinguishes one class of birds from another. Differences that we can't tell by simply looking, to be able to distribute and give them their appropriate assignments. To make the picture clear, imagine a bird having access to our human world, to fire-making, trade, the wheel, construction, agriculture, the table of elements, calculus, Maxwell's equations, etc. These are things that are incomprehensible to them, not because they're too difficult, or that they are intellectually too simple to understand them, have smaller brains or infinitely fewer brain cells, as we say, but simply because our psyche is of a fundamentally different composition than theirs. Ours is a purely instrumental world. We have access to the molecular structure of other things. We can examine and study them, observe, abstract, classify, tabulate, analyze, calculate, all in anticipation to make use of them, something which they don't have. Take away this ability, or instrumentation, and it will immediately seem as though you've taken away all that is human. Rather, all that characterizes life, period. But in reality, what would remain is much more than what we suppose has been subtracted. That is, all other worldviews, unique to every other non-human life form. Likewise, there are tendencies that we observe birds to make that we can't explain, like why certain birds have certain migratory patterns, or how they navigate while covering such vast distances. The truth of the matter is, all life forms, animate or inanimate, are so many different teleologies or objectifications of nature. But what's that? What's that strange ability to interact with the environment at such an intimate level? To plant, build, displace, manipulate, utilize, calculate, measure, etc. What's this apparent dominion, or the perception thereof, over every environment that we find ourselves in? The Quran answers them by the term bashar. Standing before an empty swath of land, you perceive objects everywhere around. Immediately you start to think, maybe I could use the wood from that tree to make fire, or weave some rope, or use the leaves for thatching, or for medicinal purposes. Or you start to wonder if you can grow food. on that land. That industrious turn is subject to adaptation according to the environment in which you find yourself and the resources with which you're surrounded. The difference between us and animals is that animals are bound to certain environments. A gorilla could not survive in the Arctic, nor can a polar bear in the savannah. The word bashar is commonly translated as human or man, but so is the word insan, which we also find in the Quran. There must be a difference between those two terms to justify their independence but coexistence in the Quran. And on closer analysis, we find that this difference is purely taxonomic. When we define things in general, we are in practice putting our objects of definition in context, and this context is other relations which this object has. For example, you're asked to define crimson. You reply with a shade of red, and then you define red as a color. Then you define color by including it under a larger sphere of relations, and so on. In this way, the theory of taxonomy is shown to be an empirical theory of definition. Likewise is the case with bashar compared to insan. It must be explained in terms of what relations it encompasses or is encompassed by. But we must justify God's choice for not using insan in those places which he used bashar, and vice versa. This is easily answered by analogy to color. You can easily define crimson or scarlet as a color, but no one disputes that defining either as a shade of red is much more accurate and works better in contexts requiring more precision. There's a reason for choosing to call something scarlet and not red in the first place. We may ask, in the same manner, are the terms bashar and insan related? Bashar here is the genus under which falls the concept of insan, meaning a supergenus that includes the jinn and angels. What distinguishes bashar from the rest is this instrumental worldview. We see it used in the Quran in the same idiomatic sense as the English term human, namely, I'm only human, to express fallibility or proneness to error, as in the following verse, or the expression from chapter 12. Both of these verses, in addition to others, can be cited against the claim that bashar is a genus that also includes the angels, but the fact is, they are bashar. However, they share to it a transcendental relation, operating strictly in line with God's commands and not engaging in any other activities save worshipping and the maintenance of the universe. We can say that the label bashar, which connotes shortcomings, trial and error, of use and misuse, is something over which the angels represent a transcendence, but this does not mean that they don't belong to this genus. Martin Heidegger is known to have used the term Dasein, the centerpiece or substrate of his entire philosophy, defined as the form of being or existence of the human individual. To belong to the genus means that you share to it an essential psychological feature, the same Dasein. You have no choice here as to how the world may reveal itself to you. And as bashar, we are thrown, as it were, into a world consisting of objects to which we assign value based on their potential usefulness. We feel this with absolutely anything we come across. We look at asteroids and think of how we can mine them for resources. We move to a country and think of how best we can take advantage of its services to better ourselves. It's conceivable, writes Toynbee, as Bergson suggests, that the mechanisms of our intellect is specifically constructed so as to isolate our apprehension of physical nature in a form that would enable us to take action upon it. The term bashar is also used in the Quran to mean prospect or glad tidings, bushra, yubashirukum, abshiru, and so on. The Quran has given us a definition of the concept of bashar by employing it in all these different contexts. Beyond the ability to reason or the faculty of instrumentalism, which animals seem to also possess to a degree, what truly distinguishes human beings, or the concept bashar, is something a little more nuanced. We see, for instance, that instrumentalism is meaningless unless we include it under the notion of teleology. To use anything or even to analyze the properties of things is itself a purposive activity. The material offered by the environment, from animals to inanimate substances like iron, serve only as ingredients for us, by which to establish the sort of societies that we see. We see that even in their abundance, we always seek to refine our methods, to automate certain operations, to make way for higher ones. We went from donkeys and horses and camels as means of transport to automated vehicles, and in those we sought to develop them further, improving their performances, their speed, incorporating navigation systems, electricity, etc. Even with all this, we still remain restless, constantly seeking ways of taking whatever we happen to have to the next level. The precise meaning of bashar lies exactly here, this unceasing act of reaching for or grasping at a point beyond the current, an enterprising and futurizing flair. The faculty of bashar allows us to plan, to have ambitions. Any activity involving planning or enterprising, from studying for a test to setting up traps for hunting, falls under this category. We see that animals can likewise plan, like we see in honeybees, ambush predators, ants, etc., but they only do so strictly in those instances and for those particular purposes. They don't have the spontaneity which we observe in human beings, of ambition. But we can say that animals have desire, but not ambition. They have intent, but not motive. Ambition, motive, aspiration are forms of desire and intention, but for bashar, there is something more to them. These impulses seem to apply when their object does not involve survival, or let's say they don't cover the essentials of life, of sustenance and shelter like those of the animals. Food acquisition, when modified by bashar, becomes agriculture, mass production, factories, etc. It becomes entangled with other areas, and this entanglement eventually amounts to a society, finance, politics, military, etc. It's this initial transcendental impulse, represented by the concept bashar, concatenating into a vast operation that involves other members of the species that distinguishes our genus from animals. It's virtually impossible, or let's say unthinkable, to imagine a mode of being that does not entail this, to picture an absence of ambition or aspiration. And our inability to do this defines the limit of our human world. There is, in addition to this, the apparent affinity between the human body and the environment. It may be said that the body is an index or measure of the mode of being. As Cassary notes,
the human body and the differentiation of its parts serves as one of the first and necessary pillars of linguistic orientation. In certain languages, the differentiation of the parts of the body serves as a general schema for the articulation of the world as a whole. Each particular thing designated by language is first linked with a part of the body, the mouth, the legs, the head, the heart, etc., and according to this basic relation assigned to a specific class or genus.
We find in the Quran a confirmation of this, the use of hands, feet, chest, and the heart as ways of denoting certain metaphysical principles. For example, the use of hand, yed, as a metaphor for equipment. This may be used as a building point for a general theory concerning the relation between a particular body structure of a given species and their psychological and mental orientation. Or we can say that our mode of being may be deduced from the anatomy of the human body. Also, we see that the system of ethics proposed in the Quran seems especially tailored for those faculties that pertain to the quality of bashar. Take eschatology, which has to do with destiny and the hereafter, where justice is served on the basis of the quality of this enterprising faculty and how it was expended. Also, we see that the aforementioned organs of the chest, the heart, the right hand, the left hand, yed, etc., apply strictly to bashar because only bashar can have possessions, or can be said to own things, as the term yamin suggests, which we explained in a previous video. Also, only a bashar can be said to have a sadr or qalb, because in the Quran, the heart is used as a metaphor for the act of setting up a goal or establishing a motive, or simply method. And the heart, qalb, on the other hand, the particular nature of the goal or motive. Hence the heart appears in certain contexts to mean fluctuation, taqallubahum, taqallub, referring to the change in one's priorities, goals, objectives, etc. And the chest relates to qalb as the means or vehicle by which those objectives or goals are reached. Thus, logically, when we speak of the heart, we do so by way of the chest, and when we speak of the chest, we do so by way of the heart. How can the chest, which we said is used as a vehicle through which a goal or objective is attained, is used to mean to conceal things, or as a thing in which things are concealed, in the context of this verse? Since we said that the chest is a goal or an objective determining function, hiding something in one's chest simply means ulterior motive or sinister intentions. It refers to those instances where morally questionable intentions or motives begin to develop. Thus we see that human anatomical parts qualify as metaphorical concepts or extensions for certain modes of human activity, and that their qualification is exclusively built upon the uniquely enterprising faculty called bashar, which man possesses. And bashar are distinguished from the rest of the animal kingdom by the extension which they enjoy from certain basal or instinctual dispositions, like desire, to ambition and aspiration, and of being methodical, resourceful, eclectic, and so on. In conclusion, we ought to avoid interpreting animal behavior by analogy to human behavior, as these are incommensurable, and instead think of the world as composed of different logical spheres. That what exists, for instance, in a bird's logical space, will be things essential to ornithological being, things that we can't really see. A bird's logical space will be different, a fly, a fish, but we can't really picture that without imputing our instrument-laden worldview. Thus, when we read that Solomon was taught the speech of birds, their mantiq, we understand by it that he could understand their reasoning and their psyche. Access to mantiq would allow us to understand all there is to know about a species, its unique and normally closed-off logical space.